Good afternoon. I'd like to welcome everyone to this week's edition of Imperial as One's Belonging series, where we explore the lived experiences of individuals from the Black, Asian, and minority ethnic communities. Individuals who have been willing to share their sense of belonging and their experiences of how their identities have been formed. I say this every week, and there isn't a week that I've been proved wrong. We have a very, very special guest because our guest this week is Gina Brown, Professor Gina Brown, who's a professor of gastrointestinal cancer imaging at Imperial College. So, Gina, I want to just say a big thank you for being our guest this week and ask you that first question, which is, can you tell me what it was or what it is that helped you to gain your sense of identity and your sense of belonging when you were growing up?
Yeah, it's a really good question because I grew up in the 60s and 70s, so I'm kind of probably one of the older spectrum of your population that you've been interviewing, and the sense of belonging came particularly, from my parents and their friends and the neighbours and so on, but cultural belonging, which I suppose is the question, was very difficult because I was the only Indian in my class or Indian descent. I was born in Liverpool
Mhm.
in the 1960s and brought up partly in Liverpool, a couple of years in Brazil, and then the rest of the time in near London in Harrow, not so far from
Yeah.
here. And in those days, I would go to school and perhaps be the only Indian in the school, or maybe one or two in total. And it was a bit of a novelty until the sort of mid 70s, when of course, Uganda and Kenya, there was a big influx. And of course, there was a lot more people of a different color skin. And that was, I think, the main thing is that I felt very sort of different.
Yeah.
But then when you're like that, you end up, and it was the same with my parents, you end up needing to and wanting to blend in
Mhm.
as best as you can. So you end up being very conscious of what everyone else is doing and being the same. And that's, I suppose, how you adapt. And that's so you end up sounding and behaving very English. And you then, and I suppose that happens to a lot of people. You get to something like my age, and you realize that actually, where do you belong? Because you're
Yeah.
not. I haven't got the full. If I go to India, they look at me as a foreigner, and in this country, I'm not. Obviously, physically, I'm not English.
Yeah.
So, and then you ask yourself, well, does it really matter? And actually, it probably doesn't. So, yes, you want to belong because you want to be accepted and you want
Mhm.
to be respected and so on. But those things come from um, how you behave and how others behave around you. And I think, somewhere like Imperial or in many of the places I've worked at, the sense of belonging comes from contributing to the institutions, the organizations, the people around you,
Mhm.
and that's then sort of paid back, as it were. So yeah, belonging is there's the very strict definition of cultural belonging, where I think I'm a bit of a nomad,
Mhm.
and then there's the belonging, as in, belonging to somewhere like Imperial, where people look after you. That's my experience anyway.
Thank
But
you.
yes, yeah,
I can see the complexity of your answer in terms of, kind of like the cultural belonging, but also the belonging based on the place where you choose
yeah,
to gain your sense of belonging from. And
yeah,
sometimes those align nicely, sometimes they don't.
yeah.
So you mentioned the fact that your parents came over from India and
Mm,
and there was the point which you said about them wanting to blend in.
Mm.
Can you describe in what ways would you say that they were trying to blend in? And
Mm.
what would you say was the rationale or reasoning for wanting to blend in as it
Yeah.
were?
Yeah. So again, with them in their neighborhood, they were the only
Hmm.
Indian minority in the whole street,
Hmm.
they were regarded as somewhat of a novelty, and people were very welcoming and friendly, but I think they didn't really want to stand out. They wanted
Hmm.
to be part of the community and just throw themselves into it. So the Indianness of their culture, which is innate because they were born and brought up there, um, was was part of what they could bring to the local community, but didn't define them, as it were. So
Yeah.
they actually became um, they. I think what they used to say to me when I was growing up is, "We've taken the best of both cultures, we think,
Hmm.
and
Hmm.
we have jettisoned things that we don't like about Indian culture, and we've uh, ignored things that we don't like about English culture and taken the things that we do like,
Hmm.
and the pluses hopefully make something even better."
Hmm.
So that's what that's what I meant by sort of wanting to fit in and mix in, but it also retaining some of the deep values they held
Hmm.
from being Indian, and a lot of that revolves, as you might imagine, from strong family values,
Hmm.
but not necessarily strong traditional values. Just being regarding family is really important.
Hmm.
That and also the sense of family duty and
Hmm.
that sort of thing.
Hmm.
But then equally, not what they didn't like about some of the Indian culture that they came from was the interference in people's lives. So they were quite happy to be
Right.
away from that. So so I think they didn't, so there's a balance, isn't there?
Hmm.
And I think that's what they successfully struck that balance. I think
Yeah.
it was a nice upbringing and a nice childhood. And I wouldn't have said it was particularly traditional, nor
Hmm.
would I have said it was particularly, you know, out and out English.
Hmm.
It was a mix. But most of well, all of my school friends were English and culturally completely different background, but
Yeah.
um, it didn't sort of notice. We just sort of got on
We,
and yeah.
I suppose from your perspective as a child growing up, being one of only a few, and
Mm,
then saying, okay, how do I fit in? Um,
mm,
your experience would have been slightly different to that of your
correct.
parents who had come
Yeah.
over from the
Yes.
subcontinent, etc. All right.
Yeah.
So that was your frame of reference, and it was
Yes.
how do I fit in here? But for
Yeah.
them, it would have been would that
Even harder. Yeah.
yeah, yeah.
So, I mean, like for instance, my mother, changed her haircut.
Hmm.
She dressed, she didn't dress like an Indian,
Hmm.
she didn't wear the sharis and clothing in that way. She used to just wear whatever was fashionable. She'd be wearing, you know, um, all the 1960s clothes. She'd have her hair in a beehive and all sorts. So, she loved dressing up, and she loved embracing the culture. So I think that was quite nice to see. And so that's the sort of outward appearance. But I think inwardly, you know, she would even absorb different cooking. She'd experiment, and
Hmm.
I think she would have a mixture of friends who were also from India, but also friends that she'd met at work and so on. So I think they, I don't think they felt like I think they just adapted in the way
Hmm.
that you notice a lot of people adapting, and
Hmm.
um, she wouldn't be now the same person that she could possibly have been if she'd stayed in India. And so
Yeah.
that's the effect
Yeah.
of
Yeah.
British culture on their own outlook.
Yeah.
Um,
And
and yeah,
and I suppose that rubbed off in you because seeing your mother dressing in the local fashion as
yes,
the fashion
yeah,
that gave you license as well to say, okay,
yeah,
Mum's doing it, I can do it, and I can fit
yeah,
in.
yeah,
Yeah.
yeah. So she consciously didn't want to be seen as traditional.
Yeah.
She wanted to be seen as sort of modern thinking and forward
Yeah.
thinking. And actually nowadays in India, a lot of the current generation are like that too. So I mean, everything's moved on.
Yeah.
So
Yeah.
I think what she didn't sort of stop us from being aware of our culture.
Hmm.
She didn't spend an awful lot of effort and time telling us about it because there was much else to get on with in life.
Yeah.
So,
Yeah.
yeah, she didn't consciously teach us to speak her mother tongue.
Hmm.
And so the only way I learned it was from playing with my cousins whenever we went on any trips to India.
Yeah.
I
Yeah.
wasn't taught. It was just I had to survive with my cousins. But you know, so that you learn culture in different ways, and it wasn't a major thing that
Hmm.
she promoted, but it was kind of in our way of life, and our values were very much about the family and about looking after one another, and
Hmm.
education and
Hmm.
striving for attainment
Hmm.
in education was always that was just kind of a given. And yeah,
No,
so
that's really interesting in that you said your family unit was central.
yeah,
Yeah, that was
yeah,
central. And
mm,
as you said earlier on about the family values, and for the
mm,
family values, it was about getting a good education and seeing where that takes you,
yeah,
and what and the
yeah,
potential that a good education could give you.
yeah,
Yeah.
yeah,
So what will
yeah,
so being the only child in or only Indian child in your school, did that
yeah, pretty much, yeah.
yeah, how accepting of it, not accepting might be the wrong. What was your experience, I should say, going through
Yeah,
school?
yeah. So I mean, I think in junior school, I think I can't remember if there might have been one or two others, but certainly in my year group, I was definitely the only one. Going into senior school, there were about two or three. And
Oh
at
my,
university, I think there were about eight of us in our year at medical
wow,
school. It
wow,
was it was it was a
wow,
different time.
yeah,
So I think the as we there was 1970s Britain could
mhm,
be great and bad at the same time, and
yeah,
there was
yeah,
undoubtedly, to say there wasn't racism it is kind of to be, you know, you just blind and deaf.
yeah,
But
yeah,
there was, but it didn't really affect me particularly. And I think in class there were some unpleasant, there were episodes of bullying, and there were some unpleasant teachers who, probably shouldn't, nowadays wouldn't
wouldn't
be allowed
make
to get away with what they did and what
it.
they said.
Yeah.
But it's I suppose these are the things that make you what you are, and you adapt, and it makes you more conscious about the importance of developing strong friendships that you can fall back on, because for every kind of nasty idiot, there's several really nice people who are very supportive, and so that's what you always have to sort of remember, that
Mm.
in the end, those people are probably slightly insecure. That's why they behave in that way, and you've got the security of your family and your friends, and I think that's what kept me going really through those some of the difficult times. But
Wow.
yeah,
S- s- uh, but clearly, even through those difficult times, academically, it didn't dissuade you from the academic
uh,
values
I
which.
yeah, I think it made me more determined to succeed academically. So whenever you're underestimated, which
Mhm.
that's probably the story of my entire child. That nobody thought there was going to be anything great coming here.
Yeah.
So I was always underestimated. But then that's really good because it there's no pressure, and it meant therefore that I was continually surprising people with the results and so on, and that's good because it kind of made me quietly determined to just prove everyone wrong or do better. And yeah, I was not yeah, I just wanted to be the best at everything that I did,
Mhm.
apart from sports. Because I was hopeless at sports. I just couldn't, there was no chance. But yeah, in terms of academic stuff, yeah.
So you use you use the fact that they underestimated your abilities almost as
Yeah,
your advantage to say, I can just work hard under the radar, as it were,
yeah,
and just
yeah. There's
keep,
no,
yeah,
yeah, there's no expectation, and
yeah,
there were really bright kids, going through, and I would just sort of take my inspiration from other bright kids who very often
hmm
became my friends,
hmm
and use that to sort of set myself targets. Like I'm going to see if I can get as good a mark as they in their
yeah,
exams, and
yeah,
maybe at some point even do better. And that's what happened. So you just work at it. So yeah, I guess um, yeah, it's nice sometimes not to have too much expectation thrown at
hmm
you.
yeah. So what stage? Because clearly you've gone on to become mentioned about going to medical school. At what stage did kind of like your focus, your vision, and become, all right, I would like to do medicine, or I'd like to go to medical school? And were there pressures from your family to
Yeah,
say,
yeah.
yeah,
But no, I mean, as much as the stereotype is that you should become a doctor, lawyer, and engineer, that I don't think my parents were like that.
hmm
That their thing was do what you're good at and find out what you're good at. And I happen to be good at maths and sciences, but I didn't like them as pure subjects. I wanted to apply them in some
hmm
way. So that was the decision, and I think when I was sort of between sort of 16 and 18, I had opportunities to do some volunteering in the community, and I would attend an old people's home, and I just sort of it was at that stage when I thought, gosh, wouldn't it be good to be able to apply science to the things that we're seeing around us and the
hmm
suffering of the elderly, which some of those old people's homes that I was at, they were in a really it was really sad to see the
hmm
state
hmm
of of health, and you can't imagine yourself in that position, and it
hmm
seems so alien to get into that sort of state as an elderly person that
hmm
I wanted to go into medicine to help that, as it
hmm
were. It was a kind of uh, very naive thing that you can fix problems
yeah,
with
yeah,
science.
yeah, yeah.
And
But
partially you can.
yeah, yeah. But it was the idea of helping these old people, or helping old people
Yes,
or elderly
yes,
people, so that they
yes.
weren't in that kind of suffering.
Yeah.
Could I just double
Mm.
check? Did you have much interactions with your grandparents though? Because
Um,
you had
yeah.
come, was that part of it? I don't know. I'm
Yeah,
just being
no,
curious.
it's a good question. So my grandmother came and stayed with us for a long when her husband died, when my grandfather died. My grandmother came just spend a bit of time because she'd been nursing him for almost 15 years.
Mhm.
And she shared my bedroom. So we were roommates, roommates for almost 2 years. And
Yeah.
we grew very close, actually. And she was an amazing person. And she sort of embodied what being old should be. She wasn't that old actually, but she seemed old at that time. But she embodied what being an elderly person and being revered in the family was about. And I suppose the thing that it really surprised me was how people, and it still surprises me, how the elderly are often not revered in the way
Mm,
that they are in Indian
mm,
communities.
mm,
So that was the thing, that yeah, the elderly are sometimes, certainly in when I was at school and going to those old people's homes, they were sort of, talked down to as like they were children, and I thought that was bizarre.
yeah,
Um,
yeah,
and because they can't hear, suddenly, it's really kind of, and
yeah,
I thought, God, these are bright, and these, some of these are like were teachers, and they were, and now they're being spoken to like they're sort of imbeciles,
yeah,
and I didn't like that, and it didn't, I just felt I needed to do something in medicine to help with that situation. I didn't know exactly what, but I did do care of the
yeah.
elderly as
But
a SHO for a couple of years at least, until I found my calling in radiology. But yeah,
that's really interesting, and just that's tapping on the fact that you spent such a long time with your grandmother, um, helping to shape. Because I think the thing which you kind of
mm,
like alluded to there was that intergenerational
mm,
connection, and sometimes
mm.
without having spent the time with the different generations, that wisdom and knowledge isn't necessarily passed on. If
No, that's
yeah,
it. Yeah,
and
and yeah,
so
she had a way about her. Yeah, she had a sort of gentleness without ever raising her voice. She would persuade people of a different path,
yeah.
which it amazes me to this day how she would be able to do that. But yeah, she was incredible. Yeah.
Fantastic. So in medical school, you went to medical school, and again, it sounded as though that you were kind of like one of a minor, only eight
Yeah.
students,
Yeah.
of Indian heritage in the school. What was your
Mm.
experiences kind of like on the wards and going through medical school? Did you enjoy that process? Did you?
Yeah. Yeah. I think, I mean, it was a great time, and I really enjoyed it. I found it incredibly challenging.
Mhm,
From sort of being kind of exceptional at my school, small school, to just
mm,
being pretty average or below average in a medical school. It was a big sort of mental transition. And
mhm,
but I think the thing that probably I was more aware of wasn't so much um, the fact that I was of Indian origin. It was more the fact that it was very male dominated in the sort of
mm,
80s and early
mhm,
90s. And actually there were elements of it that felt much like like it was a boys' club, and as a female medic trying to get through it all, you always had to do a little bit better, and you always had to be a little bit better,
mhm.
just to gain equal footing, just to get shortlisted.
Wow.
And there were a lot of disparaging sort of comments about women in medicine in those days. I mean,
Mhm,
obviously it's not like that now, but
mhm.
I think that was the tough part of progressing.
So did you have any role models, mentors at that time? Where did you get that strength or the strength to continue on when you're facing
Mm,
these
yes,
disparaging comments, and
yeah,
you can see the inequalities,
yeah,
and it's only
yeah,
because of your gender, really?
yeah, and I think that's right. And I think there were very few, but when you came across them, you didn't forget them. So the female leaders in the sort of 80s and 90s that I came across, and this is after qualifying as well, um, they were kind of more Mrs. Thatcher than anything else. They were that kind of very powerful, very sort of in a way, a little bit, and that was always the risk that they would overcompensate.
Right. Yeah.
But they were successful,
Yeah.
and possibly because they overcompensated. But often you would come across them, and they'd be striking in their kind of more than resilience, toughness, as well as kind of they had to be extra brutal, you know. So,
Oh.
but they were, you know, we owe it a lot to them because they forged the way,
Hmm.
and sometimes, perhaps more often than not, they would help those that were coming behind them. You know, they didn't feel threatened by them, but occasionally you'd come across someone who felt threatened by
Yeah.
another
Yeah.
woman in the room. So
Yeah.
it was it. Thank God things have changed. You know,
Yeah.
I sound like an old old, but it's a historic, almost imperceptible from from year to year. You don't notice it, but things do change.
Yeah.
And much as across the Atlantic they want to turn it back to the 1950s, it ain't going to
Yeah.
happen because things have changed, and we're not going back
Yeah.
to those kind of days. And that's a good thing, because then everyone can achieve their potential. Um, so
It's,
yeah.
it's interesting what you said there about the women who made it, or who got to those higher
Mm,
positions, and you're talking about it almost like them overcompensating. But you could
mm,
almost, thinking about what you had said earlier on, where you said when you went into the class and when your parents came, it was about blending
mm.
in, and
Yeah,
whether
yeah,
or not they felt the same thing, that in order
yeah,
for us, we have
yes,
to blend in, so
yes,
we have to do
yes,
what the
yes,
model that we're
yes.
seeing, you know.
Yeah, absolutely. And I think you see examples of people, certainly in my gen. Well, I think you could argue that I've overcompensated. I sound, there's not, if you turn the screen off, you wouldn't think that I was in any way Indian. And that's the thing, isn't it? I've
Yeah.
overcompensated so that I've lost my cultural root
Yeah.
in when you speak to me on a personal basis. It's only when you sort of go deeper into things that you realize that there is an influence
Yeah.
from my Indian heritage, but it's not obvious.
Yeah.
So
D-
uh, yeah, so yes, that's overcompensation. That's an example of it, isn't it?
yeah.
Um,
Yeah.
in
But
order to survive. But
in order to
yeah,
survive. Yeah. So
yeah,
it's
yeah,
almost like
yeah,
you having to lose part of yourself in
yeah,
order to be able to progress in a
yeah,
society, and not
yeah.
necessarily saying that the society has to adapt in any ways, although now we can
No,
see that is adapting,
yeah,
but
yeah,
it was felt that actually
yeah,
you're the one who
yeah,
has to adapt. The
yeah,
society doesn't, you
yeah.
know.
Exactly, exactly.
So you mentioned about the fact that you had done a lot of work. Well, you were work really looking at working with the elderly,
Yeah.
um, and you did elderly care for a while. So how did you transition from the work which you were doing there to the kind of thing that you're doing now, or
Yeah,
to
I
go
think
to the
yes. Yeah,
both?
yeah, I did medicine for the elderly, and then I did chest medicine for a few
Hmm.
years while I was doing my MRCP, because in
Hmm.
those days you had to get all this extra experience before applying to do radiology.
Hmm.
Um, and it was during that sort of training, and during the sort of preparation for the MRCP, that I realized that I actually really love the diagnostic puzzle,
Hmm.
having
Hmm.
coming to a diagnosis rather than the whole sort of chronic management. And there's nothing more immediate than the diagnostic impact of imaging in getting to the bottom of a problem. And I
Hmm.
love that. So actually it it became a fascination for me, imaging. And fortunately, I managed to get a place on the radiology training program. But if I hadn't have got that, my backstop was to apply for a care of the elderly scheme, training
Hmm. Hmm.
as a registrar in that. So it was just luck. There were 17 people in the waiting room for the interview. I think 4 posts, and I was one of them that got it. But it was just random luck, and I ended
Um,
up going into radiology.
right,
So
I'm going to press you a bit on this about random luck. There's nothing called, but tell me, can you remember the interview? Can you remember the kind of
yeah,
questions?
I
Because
I I
then,
remember. Yes,
because
I
I'm
I
just one.
remember the interview. Yeah.
Mhm. The
Well, I
reason
think they want. Yeah, go on.
No, the reason why I asked that question is because earlier on you said about you were always kind of under the radar, but you had that competitive, well, competitive might not be the right word, but you had that steely determination. I can show
Yeah,
them. Yeah. So
yeah,
what was that
yeah,
interview like? And
yeah.
did that steely well, clearly it did come out, but how did it come out?
Yeah, no, that was it. It was all. There was a lot of preparation before that interview, to the point
Hmm.
where I I was at the St. George's rotation for radiology, but prior to that, I was doing care of the elderly at St. George's.
Hmm.
And I approached the radiology head of training to say, like, I really, really would like to do radiology. What sort of things could I do? And they said, oh, there's an audit project you can get involved in. So I think that was a throwaway line, and that I think they just thought that they'd get rid of me. But so that, I ended up spending every weekend spare going in to get the data for that audit project. It turned into a massive thing. I was auditing the use of brain CTs in the elderly, and it resulted in a publication. So for someone who's an essay, quite junior,
Yeah, yeah.
it resulted it resulted in presentations and publications. And the people that were co-authors on this were, in the radiology department at St. George's. They loved it. And so by the time I got to the interview, even though I had not excelled at medical school, or hadn't taken any major, fantastic jobs afterwards, it was this, as you say, kind of, I don't know if it's steely determination or just stubbornness. I just like, I just nailed the interview because of all this background work I'd done. And I'd given up weekends and weekends of my life to this project. And luckily it came to. But it then gave me a taste for writing papers and analyzing data, and the maths bit of it suddenly came alive in me. And I love looking at spreadsheets, and I love looking at data from studies, and comparing things and analyzing stuff. And it just that's what took hold of me, and that's how I ended up becoming an academic radiologist. My love of spreadsheets.
That's not often something that I hear on this
No,
program, but that's
no.
brilliant. You know
Mm,
what I hear from there is as well is that you were willing to put in hours which other people weren't necessarily willing to do.
yeah,
You were willing to seize an opportunity which other people may not have even seen being there, if that
yeah.
makes sense. And
It wasn't so much that, Wayne. I think it was more that I knew that if I didn't seize that opportunity, there'd be no chance. So I
right,
needed to seize that opportunity, and
yeah,
others could breathe into that interview
hmm,
because they were who they were,
yeah,
and they had fantastic references, and people had
hmm,
made phone calls and what have you. I didn't
hmm,
have any of that, so it was all on me and how I could impress those around me with my own efforts. And that I think is the realization that you have to do things and prove things yourself.
yeah,
No one's going to help you.
yeah.
Um,
So you have one prove things to yourself, but also prove
yeah,
things to other
yeah,
people that
exactly.
I deserve to be at this table.
Yeah,
I've
yes,
done the
I'm
work.
I'm equal to it. Yeah,
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 yeah.
yeah.
But there's one thing being a radiologist, right? But then an academic radiologist, that's slightly different. Can you just
Mm.
explain the difference between the two components, if
Yeah,
that's all right?
yeah. So, yeah, and I think in general in medicine, why I think an academic pursuit of what you do in your daily work is kind of critical to being useful as a doctor. I mean,
Mhm.
I'm not saying that people who don't do research are not useful, but I think that to get the most out of your career, you need to understand why and what you're doing and what
Mhm.
the impact is and what the
Mhm.
outcomes are. And if you
Mhm.
don't study that, then you can quite rightly question why on earth you're doing it. So
Mhm.
it was kind of innate, really. In the
Mhm.
end, you realize that a lot of the things that you do are done because somebody's told you it must be so. But as soon as you
Mhm.
start to dig below the surface and question, well, why do we do things in this way? You realize that the evidence base very often isn't as strong as it should be,
Mhm.
and there's always room for improvement. So
Mhm.
so the research was always in my mind, and how to do it and how to frame the questions to get an answer in a reasonable time frame and change practice. That's been the thing to learn as I've gone through life. Um, but I always wanted to find the scientific basis for the things that we do, and very often found it to be lacking. So that's the thing, isn't it?
Yeah, yeah,
You
yeah.
know, it
So
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 that's yeah,
it was born out of a curiosity. That there was a curiosity,
mm,
but actually there was a curiosity because you wanted to not you found a purpose in the curiosity because there was something that you
yeah,
were trying to solve. Yeah,
yeah.
or to
It
contribute
to
towards
improve
them.
upon,
Yeah,
yeah, to
yeah.
to find out. So one of the big things that I feel I've contributed to is this idea about diagnostic accuracy.
Hmm.
And in imaging and certainly in rectal cancer, the accuracy was always determined by whether the pathologist agreed with you.
Hmm.
Okay, so your accuracy was only as good as the pathology report and how detailed that was.
Hmm.
And what I learned over the years was actually both can be correct, but in different ways. And so
Hmm.
what I learned a little bit, and I'm still sort of proving a lot of it, is that there are features that you see on the scans that predict the outcome sometimes better than the pathology does.
Hmm.
And and when you've got, if you investigate those and note them and record them and then look at the outcomes, which is what I've done in the studies and the trials and just through sort of observing over the years, you find that the traditional way of reporting and the old way doesn't give you that prognostic accuracy, doesn't give you the accuracy that you need in order to say to a patient, well, this is your risk and this is based on this, because when we've looked at this and looked at the outcomes, this is what happens. And it's that kind of level of questioning
Hmm.
that has led to some of the research success. So not to take a gold standard as a gold standard unless you can prove it to be so.
Yeah.
Um, so
And
yeah,
so you've had based off that, you've had that where you talk about the accuracy is being determined by the outcome and looking at the predictive factors,
yeah,
which are the most
yeah,
important predictive factors of
yeah,
what the outcome's going to be.
yeah, exactly.
And so
Yeah,
you're able to, I would assume then that based off what you've said, that
yeah,
you're able to look at and potentially at earlier time frames and be able to say,
yes,
actually, this is the
yeah,
most likely outcome based off
yeah,
the images that I'm
yes,
seeing.
exactly. And not only that, but when you look at those early time frames, and then you can intervene and change those features. So with
Okay.
a treatment approach, you can say, okay, that can be reversed. That can
Hmm.
be we can do something about that, and then that patient may not then get a recurrence.
Hmm.
So
Hmm.
so it's that stepwise thing, which with cancer particularly, just to say it's T3N1 or there's some
Hmm.
enlarged nodes doesn't give you the detail that you need to say, actually, this patient's going to have this and this as a potential problem going down the line. And so that's the sort of stuff I've been doing is looking at, it's all there. It's always been there on those images. It's just people
Hmm.
don't record it.
Yeah.
And so when
Yeah.
you look for some of this stuff and it's extraneous to what's the minimum requirement demanded of you, so you can
Hmm.
produce a report in 5 minutes, but it has no useful information.
Yeah. 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 Yeah.
And and when people talk about radiology and turnaround times and getting reports out, they forget that actually there's information there that takes time to extract, and you
Yeah.
need to understand what it is you want to find from it that's going to help the patient.
Hmm.
That can't be done by a machine learning program. It's got to be
Hmm.
done by science, hypotheses, and outcomes analysis. You
Hmm.
can't do that. You can't just feed that stuff into a machine and expect the computer to say, "Oh yeah, this is the score," because they don't know
Oh,
what they're looking for. Yeah, it's
right.
it's
Oh,
it's so there's so much about human anatomy and pathology and physiology and all sorts of immune processes that are more complex that we kind of are beginning to get a feel for, but I think we're far from getting to where we could be.
so
Um,
I like the way that you put that, because I was gonna say, oh, what about AI? I was gonna, but
yeah.
you cut my legs off before I got started. Right?
Well,
Uh,
I think you're not unique because when you hear the ministers and government talking that oh there's a shortage of radiologists, but that's not a problem because we're going to have AI, and you sort of think that's not understanding the thing with imaging is it's
mhm,
a process,
mhm,
and it's and everything we do in medicine has got to be hypothesis driven, and I'm not sure that any computer can generate a hypothesis.
mm,
You can feed data in. It's basically a
mhm,
spreadsheet
mhm,
an
mhm,
analysis tool. It's just
mhm,
going to look at data. It's not going to form the thinking that says, I wonder why a patient with this is going to get this.
mhm.
It's not going to join the dots. We have to join the dots. So yeah.
Just kind of like an aside to that, because I understand, is there any way that computerized tools, etc.,
Mm.
can assist? Can they be assistants, and in which and in
Mm.
what ways would you say that they could be
Yeah.
effective assistants?
Yeah. So I think that a lot of what we do is quite laborious, like taking measurements, um, transcribing what we're seeing, and we've prepared an image array and we can see what we want to say, but getting that onto a text report, it would be so nice if the highlights of what we've noticed and observed just automatically get transcribed
Hmm.
in a shorter way, in a more
Hmm.
efficient way. But a bit like when you encounter a patient in a clinic and you've had an interaction with them, you've then got to stop and write everything down that you've
Hmm.
had as that
Hmm.
interaction. Ideally, you want a personal assistant to
Hmm.
write down everything that you're saying and make it into sensible
Yeah,
language. So
yeah.
in a way, you want to do the human stuff and you want the machine to take the laborious stuff off you.
Hmm.
And you can't confuse the two. They
Hmm.
are two different processes. Um,
I like that idea. I like that idea. I'm just wondering to myself, because I don't know the field, but I've wondered to myself if there was ways in which you could have checklists
yeah,
where you would say these are the things which you need to be
yeah,
looking for, right?
yeah, yeah,
And be able to, I don't know, automate it in that kind of way to say check
yeah,
this, check this, check this, check this, and once you've done
yeah,
all, almost like an MOT. So
yeah,
when we
yeah,
go for
yeah,
the MOT, it checks
yeah,
220 characteristics or whatever
yeah,
else, and then it
yeah,
gives us an output. Either the car's
yeah,
functional or the car's not
yes,
functional. So
yes,
in that kind, could something be, I don't know, could something be
yeah.
devised or
Yeah,
developed?
I think you're right. I mean, in a way, it's kind of what we do. And well, certainly what
Hmm.
I do is I have a sort of
Hmm.
template for reporting that makes sure that I don't forget anything when I'm
Hmm.
putting a long sort of complex report together.
Hmm.
And it would be nice if that came up automatically on the
Hmm.
system and actually prompted me when I was on the right image to say,
Hmm.
have a look at this and make sure you've
Hmm.
looked at that.
Hmm.
Um, I don't think the machine learning capabilities will enable us to not look.
Yeah.
We have to look,
Yeah.
but it can certainly help us by prompting us to say, have you remembered to look for this? Have you looked
Yeah.
at, have you considered this? And that sort of thing. And I think that would make us sharper.
Hmm.
Um, it probably wouldn't save us any time, but it would certainly improve the quality of what we do. And
Mm.
and that's
Mm.
one of the things that we also have to think about is,
Hmm.
can we improve the quality of the information we convey from our imaging?
Mm.
Yeah.
I'm going to ask just kind of like a couple more questions and then I'll come to my final couple. I'm just interested because it's, as you said, when you were going through your medical school, it was very heavily male dominated, etc., and things like that. In the field of radiology, right, have you found your sense of identity, sense of belonging within this field? And if so,
Um,
how? Mm. And this might be,
yes.
you don't have to answer this question if it's going to
Yes.
improve.
Well, yes and no. I think
Mhm.
probably largely no. I feel a bit
Mhm.
detached from radiology because of the approach I've taken, which is much more about using the imaging to make treatment decisions. And I've been more, I think I've been to more surgical and oncology conferences than I have to radiology conferences, for
Mm.
example.
Mhm.
And I tend to find that the work and the research that I'm doing is much more about improving the outcomes that the surgeons achieve and the oncologists achieve using the imaging as their tool.
Mhm.
And therefore, I get much more from the dialogues with them
Mhm.
than I do with the radiologists who are focused much more on what the machines can do. So
Right. Yeah.
I've ended up becoming a bit of an, I went to the radiology meeting last week or the week before, and it was wall to wall all about AI and this machine doing this and that machine
Mhm.
doing that. And there was relatively little about improving patient outcomes. Very little, you know.
Mm.
Um, Mainly possibly because they think that's not in their hands. It's not their,
Mhm.
as a radiologist, it's not down to you because you don't see the patient. So therefore, it's nothing to do with you. You're just the technician that should provide
Mhm.
a report, and everyone else make. But I feel strongly that in a way, the radiologist is there for the patient, conveying the patient's information to the team to help them make a decision and to contribute to that decision making. So I, I find myself in
No, no,
I'm
no.
again I'm neither, like, I couldn't go to a colorectal surgical meeting and be like a colorectal surgeon,
Mhm.
and neither could I be in a radiology meeting and feel totally at home there. So I'm in the same sort of limbo that I am as, as a British born Indian. So
It's
I think actually it's just, yeah, that question, I've never really thought about it, but actually that is exactly what's happened to me.
the,
I
but
remain an outsider.
you're not an outsider, trust me. You know what I got from what you just said is that the patient voice is very important to you.
Yeah,
And the patient voice isn't just what the patient speaks to us, it's what their
no,
body is telling us. And the images that
exactly.
you're able
Yeah,
to
yeah,
convey is another
yeah,
way of amplifying the voice of the patient.
yeah, exactly. That's exactly it.
And so we need that because people are going to be taking intervention
Yeah, yeah,
strategies based
yeah,
on the information, the voice of the patient.
yeah, exactly, exactly. And yeah, that's, I feel personally responsible if something goes wrong in an operation because it means the information wasn't conveyed
Mhm.
and the job wasn't done well.
Mhm.
So we need to learn from that and we need to do better. So, if everything's working, what you say, the surgeon comes back to you and says, "Oh, you were right."
Yeah, yeah, absolutely.
And that's what and it's not because you were right, oh, I feel
Hmm.
great about myself. It's thank God the patient, it all went well for the patient.
Yeah,
That's really what it means.
yeah.
It means that the plan worked. The
Hmm.
advice that we gave and what subsequently happened, it all worked. And that's
Hmm.
what you want 100% of the time.
Fantastic. Listen, we are virtually out of time, but I'm gonna ask my final couple questions, right? And they are, um, looking back, they're kind of like this, the same question, just said slightly differently. What advice would you have given to your younger self? And then the second half of the question is, um, what do you think your younger self would look at you now and say, wow?
Okay. The advice I give my younger self. It's very difficult because if I talk to my younger self and had take my advice, for example, if I said everything's going to be fine, doesn't matter that you failed your anatomy exam this time, or maybe I wouldn't have been so
Determined. Or yeah,
doggedly pursuit. Yeah.
yeah,
So that
yeah.
so the dogged pursuit is a reflection of the fails and the need to keep proving myself. So
Hmm.
if I said to my younger self, "You're fine, chill," I probably wouldn't have done those things. So I suppose, yeah, I think I would leave my younger self alone. That's probably a thing that let them learn
Listen,
the
you're
hard way
no,
how things.
it's a very valid argument. So okay, let's switch it round then. So what do you think your younger self would
And
look at you
then
now and say, wow?
I think, yeah, I think they would be rather surprised because it's not what my younger self imagined I'd be doing or being. Um, but there are versions of my younger self that wanted to become an astronaut. So it just depends on how far back I go. But say if I go to my sort of sixth form self, I
Yeah.
think there's so much self-doubt about the
Hmm.
future and what you might
Hmm.
be and whether you could even earn a living,
Hmm.
because those were the sort of Thatcher years where there was
Yeah.
big unemployment, and
Yeah.
yeah, I would have been, I think, quite glad that I've got a job and
Yeah.
quite glad that I'm enjoying my work.
And those are the two important things. Good
Yes,
job, enjoying your work,
yes,
lovely family around you. You
yes,
know,
exactly,
that
exactly.
those are
And my two kids, yeah, of
yeah,
course. We
you
mustn't
know,
forget my two kids. Yeah,
yeah. Those are the important things, you know.
yeah, exactly,
You
exactly.
know. So yeah, no. That's wonderful. You know, it's been a real pleasure having this
Oh, thank you, Wayne.
conversation with you. It's really been eye-opening. And I can hear how you advocate. I love the fact that actually throughout there has been this spirit of advocacy for the patient, whether it was an elderly patient or whether it's the patient from the diagnostic radiography perspective, to make sure that that patient's voice is actually heard, amplified, and cherished the way it should be,
Mm,
you know.
mm.
So it's been an absolute pleasure having this conversation
Oh,
with you.
thank
Okay.
you.
All right.
Thank you, Wayne. And it was lovely talking to you.
I'm
And
gonna
I hope
just
the other,
I'm
yeah.
going to just let everybody know what's happening next week, and if anyone wants to stop on and have a quick chat afterwards, we shall do. So, um, for next week, we're going to be having Professor Anita Patel, who's a provost visiting professor in health economics at Imperial College, and so she's going to be joining us next week. And if you have missed any of our previous um, interviews, you can see them on our YouTube channel, which is tinyurl.com/belonging dash IAO. And I say this because it's really important that we celebrate all of the many voices that we have heard and the different communities that we come from and how they have helped us to become who we are and how we can advocate for ourselves and for others and help other people gain their sense of identity and belonging. So until next week, I want to say a big thank you. Have a good weekend. It is International Women's Day tomorrow. So let's celebrate with everyone to celebrate the women in our lives. And I want to just say a big thank you to all of them. Thank you very much, and I'll see you next week. Bye-bye.